going to move on to the panel discussion and introduce my panelists. So if my panelists wouldn't mind turning their camera on now, that'd be great. So I can start introducing people. So I will start off with Raj, who's all the way on the left on my screen. Raj is the chair of the British Fertility Society, and he's also a consultant gynaecologist at St Mary's, Manchester. We also have Noni Martens, who is a patient herself and a podcaster who can be regularly found blogging on her platform Fertility. We also have Yacoub Khalaf, who is an authority member for the HFEA, but is also the head of fertility services at Guy's and St Thomas's Hospital. And then very pleased to also have Christine Ekechi on the call, who is a gynaecologist and also co-chairs the Royal College of Obstetric and Gynaecologist Race Equalities Taskforce. So welcome everyone. I'm really, really pleased that you can join me today for this really important conversation. I think picking up on the audience feedback just now, it is striking that the majority of people in the audience didn't feel that these findings were surprising to them. And I think I would like to kick off with Noni and just sort of get your feedback as a patient first. When you saw these findings represented in the report today, based on your experience as a fertility patient, do you think it is public knowledge that there are different outcomes for patients based on their ethnicity when they go through IVF or fertility treatment?
I certainly don't think it's public knowledge, but I think as women are increasingly sharing their stories more openly, it is becoming public knowledge. A lot of the women I've spoken to on my podcast report fallopian tube complications, but I don't think it's common knowledge before you start trying to conceive. So a lot of the things in the report, they do happen, but only once you're in the fertility treatment world or once you're trying to conceive. But before that, a lot of people don't know a lot of the things that are happening in their body. But outside of, trying to have children, I think women are generally none the wiser.
That's a very interesting point, and I think it very much probably depends on where you are in your fertility journey as well, depending on the type of information that you have received at that point. I'll be really interested to hear from our clinical experts, and we got a few on the panel today. I think one of the questions that probably most audience members will have is, why are there differences? And I know that Nora touched on some of the various different reasons for infertility. So Christine, I'll be really interested to get your thoughts on some of the likelihood of various different infertility challenges that Black women or women of ethnic minority backgrounds are facing more generally.
Sure. Well, when we want to address this question, we have to remember that it takes two minimum to have a baby, or at least in terms of an egg and a sperm. So the first issue is that sometimes many women do not consider that there may be male factor infertility. And I think when we're having this discussion, we must remember that. When we're looking at it from the female perspective, then there will be the individual factors that can affect all women irrespective of their race. So that is tubal factors, as Noni alluded to. Sometimes it can be an issue with the womb itself. And sometimes it can be medical conditions that a woman may have that may impact on her likelihood of conceiving herself, or indeed having a successful outcome with fertility treatments. And when we're looking at Black women specifically, we know that one of the main issues, as well as tubal factors, will also be fibroids. We know that fibroids affects Black women 3 times as much as anybody else. When we're looking at it through the lens of Asian women, we know that what tends to be a bigger issue for them tends to be ovulation disorders. And then I think we need to pan out and look at it from a structural issue, a structural perspective, which is access and also knowledge. So we know that overall, most women, again, irrespective of their racial backgrounds, tend not to have a very good awareness or knowledge of their gynecological health. And as such, they may find themselves in a position where they haven't safeguarded their reproductive health, that then puts them at greater risk of infertility. And then finally, there's access. So we know that there is a postcode lottery. Unfortunately, Black and Asian women may tend to be in areas that may have more stringent limitations to NHS cycles. And if they find themselves outside of that bracket, there is a cost that can be prohibitive to many.
That's really interesting. Thank you so much for that, Christine. Yacoub and Raj, as clinicians, you are treating a various different number of fertility patients. And I'll be interested to hear your thoughts based on your experience on why you think we might see some of these differences. And also, if you think now that we have launched this report and we're trying to make the information a little bit more inclusive for all these various different patients, should patients actually receive almost sort of prospective outcomes based on their ethnicity? So Yacoub, if I could go to you first and then pick up with Raj. You're on mute, Yacoub.
Disciplined.
No,
now I am not.
Thank you.
Okay, yes. So I think the report, as some of the people reflected, that the majority thought that it's telling us something that we kind of have an idea about. And Christine elaborated on how things could explain those differences. But if you really look broader, you will find that the report is addressing a broader picture. I don't believe for a second that if a Black woman did not have tubal factor with potential blocked, distended, dilated tubes that could be pouring fluid back into the cavity of the uterus, or fibroids that is making life uncomfortable for the embryo to implant, will have any difference compared to their white counterpart. And you can extend this also to the issue of the interaction of the social and economic status, because if you present late, you will fall into a category where the prognosis is less. If you attach some kind of a stigma to seeking IVF treatment, it may also pose those kind of difficulty in presenting for medical treatment earlier. And economic factors are very important. If you fall into a different socioeconomic class, you are likely to be victim of the limitation of access, be it to private treatment or to NHS treatment. Although I have to take this opportunity and say, most patients, regardless of their race, are not getting adequate access to treatment that they need, because people need to appreciate it takes more than one attempt at IVF normally to lead to a baby. So all of that interaction between medical and social and economic and maybe genetic factors need to be explored by fine-tuning the report, by seeking a little bit more data that shed more light into the underlying cause for that discrepancy among different ethnic minorities presenting for treatment. And this is an area really for research. If these inequalities or lack of clear understanding to be explored, we need to just get some more research funding to explore a little bit deep important issues. But the message that I would like to leave people out there, just being from ethnic minority does not give you a stamp of lower outcome. It has to be individualized according to the medical circumstances.
That's interesting. Raj, can I follow up with you? Yacoub touched on age, and this is also something we have seen in the report, showing that Black patients specifically present later, so they tend to start fertility treatment around 2 years later than the average patient. What have you seen based on your experience as a clinician?
I think that's quite a striking difference, isn't it? And 2 years in fertility terms is significant, particularly when you're in your mid-30s. I suspect that this is due to a complex number of reasons. Christine raised the issue that even apart from patient-related factors, there might be factors relating to access to fertility services. It's possible that a number of Black people live in areas where the access criteria are more stringent, where it is more difficult to get a foot in the door into your nearest hospital for proper assessment and advice. There's also the possibility that because there is a higher prevalence of fibroids and tubal diseases, that these patients have undergone a series of surgical procedures or other interventions which they needed, which are correctly applied and applicable in their case, but which unfortunately have perhaps delayed them in actually getting to the IVF stage. So it is complicated, but my feeling is that it is going to be not just factors to do with the patients themselves, but also in their ability to seek access to good quality care.
Mm-hmm. That's a really important point. And I know that sort of there has been quite a few discussions previously around some of the access, but also the knowledge and feeling comfortable actually going for treatment. And I know Noni, obviously, she blogs a lot about her personal experience, and also has previously talked about some of her personal experience when it comes to some of the shame and stigma that she felt when she was first diagnosed. And Noni, can we hear from you sort of what that was like and what you have observed also speaking to other women from ethnic minority backgrounds when it comes to fertility treatment?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think there's a lot of focus on issues that are outside of the person. So there's a lot of internal stuff that happens with Black women when it comes to fertility. And the one main thing that I would highlight is the cultural stigma around not conceiving naturally is so huge. For me, I would give an example myself in my community as a Black woman. I went through a period of intense denial for about 2.5 years, and later found out it was male factor infertility. But I was in denial of the fact that it was taking us long to conceive, and it was only due to being in hospital for unrelated reasons that I was catapulted into this world of fertility treatment. And so I always think to myself, would I have sought that treatment myself willingly? I'm not convinced I would have done. And the other thing is that as Black women, motherhood is a huge part of our identity, and we're apparently hyper-fertile. So when you don't fit that narrative, there's huge feelings of shame, and usually in isolation, and you have no way to make sense of it because nobody's talking about it in your community. And for me, there just wasn't any reference to why logically, why we're not falling pregnant. And then you start to just sort of go down this dark hole, and you're alone, and there's just no one telling you to go and seek help. No one's doing that. No one was doing that for me in my community. So no one really explains that it's not linear. And so for Black women to access treatment, she has to process all of this stuff alone. And that's such a difficult thing to do. So it's a hurdle. You've got an emotional and internal hurdle away from the external factors that you've got to deal with yourself. And it's such a difficult process.
That's a really interesting point, and I can imagine as you have explored with some of the various people that you've spoken to as part of your podcast as well, is that the experience very much varies for people as well. So just because you're from one ethnic minority group, it doesn't mean you may have the same experience. Yacoub, can I touch with you on stigma as well and access? Because I know that there has been a lot of discussion around the fact that, as Noni mentioned, ethnic minority backgrounds might be a little bit more hesitant to talk about fertility related challenges. But I remember we had a conversation in the past, and you've told me that actually you have a lot of patients from an ethnic minority background that who are referring each other. So I'd be really interested to get your perspective on that as well.
I think, like Noni said, it is all about the knowledge and the awareness. And if a patient happens to speak to another patient, it might just help demystify what is involved with seeking fertility treatment. And sometimes it's something easy. It's not all fertility treatment is about IVF. It can be much more simple than that. So that bit of awareness can help a patient have the courage to go and seek advice and seek treatment. Sometimes, unfortunately, there could be factors to do with eligibility that make a patient not eligible, which means that put another obstacle until they find the funds. And IVF, let's face it, it is not, no matter how much you try to make it less costly, still it is demanding financially, and resilience is key. to approach this journey, resilience emotionally and financially, and addressing the stigma issue and addressing the social and the cultural side, as I mentioned earlier. Yeah.
Thank you for that. I think we've talked a lot about sort of especially Black fertility patients and their differences in outcome. What I found really interesting looking at this report is that Asian patients actually represent a larger proportion of IVF users at 14%. And that was quite striking to me, especially because we've previously talked about some of the stigma and patients starting, well, ethnic minority patients starting treatment later. Raj, why do you think Asian patients make up such a large group of IVF patients in your experience?
It's a difficult question to answer, Ramona, with any degree of certainty, but we do know that there is an increased prevalence of some sorts of risk factors for subfertility. We know that ovulation disorders are much more common in people from the subcontinent. Polycystic ovary syndrome in particular is more common. There are some general health issues that go with that, such as a tendency to obesity, particularly abdominal obesity, which are also negative fertility factors. Now, the majority of women with an ovulation problem should be treatable without having the need for IVF treatment. So the fact that they're still overrepresented by a significant amount in the IVF population, I think does need further investigation, and I think also needs looking into the male side a bit more. But we do know that there are factors in general, particularly in the South Asian, the subcontinental population, that increase the risk of specific types of fertility problems.
That's very interesting. Christine, as a gynecologist, have you found sort of differences when it comes to gynecological challenges between Black patients and Asian patients, or are you seeing some similarities as well?
I think the difference in terms of the number of people from the different racial categories that access IVF treatment, the difference in the proportion of donors from those racial groups, and the different causes actually lends a lot of weight to the arguments that we need to separate out. When we're talking, I mean, the term BAME, BAME, is non-specific and non-useful. And so actually what it shows is that whilst we are talking about women who essentially are not Caucasian, the differences are huge. Therefore, our approaches should be different and the solutions will be different. But ultimately, I would really prefer for us to get to a space and a time when race really doesn't even come into the conversation, because really what we're talking about are individuals. So therefore, our approaches will be different according to the individual and the factors that present before me. And I wouldn't necessarily, yes, okay, Black women are more likely to have fibroids overall, but many Black women don't have fibroids. Many Black women have polycystic ovarian syndrome, you know. So I think it's important that whilst we have used one particular lens to look at the data, and it's just one way that we've cut the data, we could use a different lens and find different groupings. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, where it can help us try and direct resources and maybe better research to try and find out a little bit more, we have to remember ultimately that it's an individual.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point, and I can see quite a few questions coming through on the chat around donation and awareness. So I will definitely pick up on that. But before we go into that, one of the key points that I would like to get your feedback on as well is the one around multiple births in IVF treatment. And we know that multiple births are the single biggest risk in fertility treatment for all patients and their babies. And we have seen in the report that Black patients had the highest number of multiple births. So they had more than one baby when going through fertility treatment. Christine, you highlighted some of the other inequalities when it comes to pregnancy relating to Black patients, but also other ethnic minority patients. And I would really like to get the panel's thoughts on why we are seeing a higher number of multiple births in Black patients specifically, but also what actions we as a sector and also clinicians would be able to undertake to maybe get that one down and make sure that all fertility patients can have safe and effective treatment. Yacoub, can I come to you on that and ask you about your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think when I reflected on this observation, I thought probably it's linked to the late presentation, because if there are 2 years difference, those 2 years could move a patient from the under 35 age group to the 35 to 37 or 38 to 39, when there is a little bit more uncertainty about single embryo transfer versus double. And so there will be a little bit more, not liberal, but less stringent criteria to stick with single embryo. And it takes few of those to make allowance for the difference between 10% multiple births and 14% that is being reported. Because like I said, it's not fine-tuned to compare like with like, it is just collective. That's the only explanation I could come up with. Perhaps presence of additional pathology makes the clinician not confident about the chance of implantation in the same way, and makes them again resort to double embryo transfer to try to make up for that lower chance of implantation. These are my only reflections on this aspect.
Yeah, that's interesting. Raj, do you find sort of in your clinical experience that patients tend to agree with the advice that they're given by their clinician, or is there sort of very much a drive from patients to go down the route that they think will be the best type of treatment for them?
I think patients do follow clinical advice in general, but when it comes to the number of embryos that are transferred for any patient, for any individual in that position, there is always a bit of interplay between the clinical advice and the patient's wishes. And if you have a scenario where the patient has been trying for years and she is literally at the end of the road and she wants to have a double embryo transfer, you would explain things to her, of course.
Oh, I think we've just lost him. We might get him back shortly. So I'll move on in the meantime. Technical difficulties, eh? One of the other elements.
But you'd have to be exception and patient desire. I think that.
Sorry, Raj, we've lost you there for the last bit. Would you be able to repeat just the last bit from your observations?
I was going to say that you'd have to be very hard-hearted to refuse a patient who is desperate and has considered all the risks and wishes to have a double embryo transfer.
Yeah.
And I don't think that that would be a good place to be.
Yeah, yeah.
Can I just add to that? Sorry.
Yes.
I think there's quite a hype around having twins in the IVF community, and a lot of people, even if you've not been doing IVF for long, if you're not older, it's just the fact that you don't have to do it again, maybe if you have twins. But I don't hear a lot about the risks, so I think there's an education and awareness piece there around that, because there is so much about, oh, they're so cute, and when they come out, there's not so much about the pregnancy and the complications that can happen around that. And I'm having a double embryo transfer this time, and I asked for it and it was an agreement, but that's because our first 2 cycles failed. So I think there's that balance of how do you give the person the best chance, but also how do you manage the risk? So I agree with what Raj said, yeah.
Yeah. And that's really interesting. I think it brings me back to my point of information for patients and where they get this from. And we have seen some comments in the Q&A session as well, with some people suggesting that there just isn't enough awareness of fertility treatment at the very outset. So where do people actually go for the information, and where can they access it? And we've had some comments from the audience around better signposting from GPs, but just more general awareness through potentially some charities, but also the sector more generally. Christine, sort of in your experience as a consultant as well, have you come across sort of similar sentiments from patients that they just didn't know about it, they don't know where to go for help when they're going through the initial stages of investigations?
Absolutely. I can see in the chats that somebody mentioned about GPs, and you're absolutely right. Conversation and knowledge, first of all, starts within our community. But, you know, as somebody else also said in the chat, it's very wrong to place the burden of responsibility within the community, particularly when we're starting off from a standpoint where the knowledge is minimal. The next step is GPs, and it's about supporting our GP colleagues with up-to-date knowledge, but also knowledge that is pertinent for management and initial investigations within the community, of which most issues can be managed. And where more specialised treatment and support is needed, early referral, but saying that women as well need to be aware of some of the limitations to access that will be in play in their particular area. And that knowledge needs to come early. What tends to happen is that people become aware of it when they're starting to seek care, ultimately and often when it is too late. I think webinars such as this are extremely helpful. And so increasing the presence and visibility of the HFEA and charities is absolutely vital. Everybody now has access to the internet. You know, people want to seek information, and it's important that we direct them to validated, trusted sources as opposed to other areas where the information may not be as of good quality.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, and it actually brings me back to another key point of the report, which was around the lack in access of donor gametes, so that's donor eggs or donor sperm. And we've had some questions here as well from the audience around, you know, awareness raising and what can be done to really encourage more donation from ethnic minority donors. We do know that based on the report, the majority of sperm donors are white, so sort of at 86%. Then there are 5% of Asian donors, 5% of mixed donors, 4% of others, and 3% only for Black donors. So that's for sperm donation. And then in terms of egg donation, it's a very similar picture, if not even worse. So we're seeing 98% of cycles are actually being done with white donor eggs. And then 59% of cycles with a mixed patient, still using white donor eggs. Again, you see 52% of cycles with an Asian patient using white donor eggs. So it's quite clear that there is a lack of access. Again, sort of in the chat, it was touched on the awareness and the stigma. I'd be interested to get your thoughts on what we as a regulator could do to potentially encourage more uptake, but also if there are any other avenues that can be taken to really encourage more donors from an ethnic minority background. Noni, can I start with you? I know you are not using donor sperm in your treatment, but has this been something that you felt has been discussed fairly open, or would you say there's been sort of very much sort of a cloak of silence around the issue of donation?
I think a lot of the Black women I've spoken to who are using donor eggs or sperm don't speak about it openly, so they say they're having IVF. You only sort of find out, I guess, towards the reality is true for them, that when they're going to have the baby, that they use a donor egg or sperm. So I've seen a lot more white women talking about donor eggs. I haven't seen, but maybe that's because of where I am in my journey. So I'm seeing where I am rather than what's actually happening. But yeah, I would say that a lot of people keep that to themselves. I think that's an added layer of stigma for sure that people would have to tackle, yeah.
That's interesting, and I've just seen in the comments here from Cetal, who said that she's undergoing treatment with a donor, and she and her husband are both of Asian descent, and they haven't even considered using an Asian donor based on the long waiting times. So it is quite clear that it's impacting people's treatment. Raj and Yacoub, sort of, how do you? I guess my question is, if an ethnic minority patient comes to you and is in need of donor gametes, whether that's donor eggs or donor sperm, how do you approach that conversation, and what kind of advice do you usually give them? Raj, if I can kick off with you, please.
Thank you. I think this is a very important point that we bring in quite early into the discussion about donor eggs, because it's about logistics, availability, waiting times. Often we will find patients are happy, or at least willing, to accept eggs from a Caucasian donor or from a mixed race donor. But even that is, even a mixed race donor availability can be challenging. And like the message in the Q&A from Cetal, a number of particularly Asian recipients, egg recipients, will travel abroad to countries where there is perhaps a better availability of people with similar skin tones. And also even people going to countries like India specifically for this kind of treatment.
Yacoub, can I pick up on this? In your experience, you've been around for quite a while. Do you find that potentially the change in anonymity law may have had an impact on the availability of donors? So just for the people in the audience, I had a conversation with a good friend of mine, and she is from an African Caribbean background, and she initially considered to become an egg donor. However, when she went to the clinic, she was then advised that due to the changes in law, any children that may be born through her donation have the right to contact her when they turn 18 years old. And ultimately that's what she based her decision on, not to donate. So I'm curious to find out if in your view, this is something that may have had an impact as well.
Yeah, I think it is plausible this may be a factor, but it's not the only factor, because if we compare the donor status in the UK compared with donation in Spain, for instance, they don't have the same regulation or the same legislation. You cannot trace the donor, and that anonymity is not removed. So that's one factor. But when we spoke to them about what facilitates their access to donor of different ethnic background, it appears that they have had campaigns which target, if target is a word, second generation ethnic minority. They go to universities and university campus and try to plead with those young men and women to help people from similar ethnic background to have families through using donor eggs and donor sperm. And it remains the case that access to donated eggs or donated sperm from those ethnic minorities will be more feasible or likely to be possible in Spain compared with the UK. So it's multifactorial. Lack of or removal of anonymity could be a factor, but it's not the only one.
Christine, I know we are sort of getting close to the end of our Q&A, but I would really like to get your thoughts. Treating various different patients from different ethnic groups, do you find that there is a certain stigma around donation? Is this something that has ever come up as part of the people that you have seen, any of the patients you have seen? Is this something that is entertained at all as a thought? And also, what are some of the sort of cultural reasons as to why people may or may not entertain the idea of donor treatment?
So I think it's true to say that there is some shyness and stigma, taboo around donation, which may be related to different cultural groups, which will have different cultural reasons, and sometimes religion. I subspecialize in early pregnancy care, so I see a lot of women who have been thankfully successful through the IVF treatment and then are looking for early pregnancy care. And I agree with Noni that where a Black or Asian woman has used an egg donor, it tends not to be information that they are forthcoming with. However, I think that will change as it becomes normalized. And that will only happen when I think conversations happen within the relevant communities. So I think it's, we cannot generalize as to the reasons. You know, there'll be different religious and local cultural interplay that will not be relevant at the level that we tend to analyze things, which is being Black or Asian. So for example, East Asians East Africans may have a different reason to West Africans. Saying that, I think it's really important that we, when we're thinking about what we now do with this information and how we change or take this data and transfer it into solutions, really driving the increase in gametes donation from Black and Asian backgrounds is really vital. Because ultimately, even if we improve the factors at the individual level and access, for those women who need an egg or sperm donor, they are severely limited, and as such, their choices are limited. And so I think it really is cognizant for us in this panel and those who are watching to really think about how we can increase that drive. And that's one of the things in the Race Equality Task Force that we are looking at.
I think that's a really good point, and I think we are coming to the end of the panel discussion, but I would really like to get your views, sort of, if based on the report and the discussion that we've had today, if there would be sort of 2 tasks that or follow-ups that you would like to see, what would they be to address some of these disparities that we've seen around donation, around birth rates across the various different ethnic groups, around information provision and access. Raj, can I kick off with you for some closing remarks?
Thank you. I think this is a very important report. It's a very powerful report. It's a very good use of the data that the UK is very good at collecting, that clinics in the UK have been very good at collecting. I think things could be better in terms of data collection. About 12% of patients, I think, didn't have their ethnicity recorded. So I think that should be something that clinics can get better at. We should also look at whether we can do more sensitive or more granular ethnicity recording, because to call people Asian in 2021 is a little bit meaningless. And so I think we could get better at that. I think as doctors, we need to get better at preparing women for fertility, for pregnancy at an earlier stage. And that involves looking at lifestyle, having a whole life course approach to their care, and working with our colleagues in primary care, I think, is extremely important. I think those would be the 2 big things that I would highlight.
Thank you. Noni, your final thoughts.
Yeah, I wondered, and I don't know, the medics will tell me, I don't know if this is possible, but I wondered whether there could be a fertility MOT of some sort before women even get to the stage of trying to conceive. So maybe, you know, in the same category as a smear test sort of thing, routine test, just come in, let's do a check. So by the time you start trying, you're quite aware of what's going on in your body. Another thing is, and I don't know if this is true, but there's this thing that you have to wait a year before before you seek treatment. A lot of Black women don't know that. They don't know that after a year you should speak to a GP at least. They don't know that at all. So I've spoken to loads of women on my podcast. They're not aware of that. So that message needs to be stronger. But the key one for me is, I think, in our dissemination of any information, any sort of education awareness piece, we need to engage in the community leaders, the religious leaders, and the ethnic minority groups, because those are the people that couples go to at times of need or when they're trying to conceive and it's not working. And if those people are ill-informed, then it just starts from there. People are having shame and staying silent and that sort of thing. So engaging families, community leaders, and authority figures in people's lives, I think, is a key one, because those are the immediate people that people go to.
Thank you very much. I think that's a very good point, and definitely something that we will be trying to take on board as well. Yacoub, your final thoughts.
Yeah, I think information and knowledge is power, and the more dissemination of information that we have about fertility, and I feel that there are some reliable and responsible sources that they are not made use of. I can give an example of Fertility Network UK. This has been long running, and I've been doing a huge amount of work in order to increase awareness and to provide some guidance and solution. There are different websites that they have the information that talk about things that could benefit patients making a decision when and how to seek advice earlier rather than later. And to try to clarify issues, because one of the questions that I could see, people are questioning what is our issues with multiple births. Mm-hmm. In 2021, this should have been made clearer. It's not about two for the price of one bargain. It's about giving two healthy babies, and that is less likely with twins than it is with singleton. So this kind of awareness needs to be, unfortunately, not a one-off, not a snapshot. It needs to be a continuous awareness campaign to make sure everybody is on the same page with issues that matter.
Thank you, Yacoub. Christine, please.
Basically, I concur with everything that's been said. I mean, from my perspective, it's just incredibly sad to really see that the inequalities that particular women face, you know, those from Black and Asian backgrounds, is throughout their life course. There's been lots of attention around maternal mortality, you know, rightly so. But we have to remember, for a good proportion of women, they don't get pregnant at all. And if they do, after a difficult journey, they then, you know, potentially are at risk of poorer outcomes. And so it's important that when we are trying to tackle inequalities, that we really approach it from the life course approach, which means we have to start from the beginning when people are young. Education is key, but it's only really effective when it happens at the beginning. And finally, for me, it's just so important that I think we work towards increasing the gamete donation from Black and Asian backgrounds.
Thank you very much. This was a very, very good and constructive conversation, and I'm sure we could have gone on and on and on about this. I will be handing over to Sally. Again, a huge thank you to the panelists for joining us today. And Sally will give some closing remarks and will also tell you guys a little bit about what some of the next actions are that the HFEA is trying to take on following this report launch. But thank you very much to the panel for joining us today.
Thanks, Ramona, and thank you again to all of the panel. I think that was a really helpful and insightful discussion, although as a patient who's been through many unsuccessful cycles, it always breaks my heart a little when we have to listen to comments like this. I think all of the panelists picked up on points that we can take forward, and they were all very helpful. So whilst the HFEA don't control all of these areas, as the regulator, what we'd like to do is examine our data a bit more and see if we can draw some more definite conclusions. I'm conscious that lots of you made the point that patients are all individuals, and you are all individuals, and that having a BAME category isn't particularly helpful. But on an individual level, patients must always be treated like that and hopefully given the best chances of success. On a more strategic level, it helps us perhaps with raising awareness, and the points you made around awareness, community discussion, and more research, which is what the HFEA will also campaign for, will help us to reach many more people through blogs like Noni's as well. I've seen a couple of media posts that have come through. So your article, Noni, has made it into Elle magazine. I'm sure people would want to look at that. And we've got a piece in the Telegraph today, and there'll be other media reports that Ramona and her team have worked on getting into the media. So everything we can do at community level, at national level through these reports, at some of the work that Christine and her colleagues are doing around the RCOG Race Equality Taskforce that the HFEA is taking part in, through our own information at the HFEA and through research using our database. I'm hopeful that if we start to produce these reports on a more regular basis, we will reach more people and we'll make an impact. Nadine Dorries, the Health Minister, also had a quote in our press release this morning, because you'll be aware there is government are launching a women's health strategy, which I think Christine touched on, and which is supposed to look at women's whole life journey. So we're hoping that fertility will be a key part of that, and that we'll be able to raise all of the issues for patients who suffer any sort of inequality. But for our experts today and our expert patients, I'd just like to thank you all so much for coming along today. I hope that the people who've listened have found it helpful, and it will at least allow you to go away and spread the word a little amongst your own communities. Thanks to Ramona for chairing and to Nora for presenting, and I hope you have a very good rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very much, everyone. Just one final closing remark from myself. We've talked a lot about the information, and I just wanted to let people know that the HFEA provides unbiased information about fertility treatment. So if you would like to have a look, you can go on www.hfea.gov.uk. You can also find us on Twitter at HFEA and on Facebook at HFEA Official. We are not on Instagram, and I'm aware that a lot of you are, but we're working very closely with people such as Noni and others who are helping us to spread the message across Instagram as well. Do keep an eye. There are a couple of things that are coming up over the next couple of months that will give patients an opportunity to get involved in our work as well. So please do keep an eye. And of course, if you have any questions about this event at all, you can always email us at communications@hfea.gov.uk. And then finally, before I let you all go, you will see that there's a short poll coming up on your screens now to just rate this event. This is really helpful for us to just let us know what we can do better in future, or if you would like to see similar events going forward. So again, thank you so much for joining us today. I think it was a very interesting conversation, and I'm sure it won't be the last. Thank you.
Thank you.